If the idea that a 70-year-old atmospheric event can shatter America's power grid, and has done it 5 times in 11 years, has you as unsettled as it has me, make sure to hit like and subscribe to Signal Watch so you don't miss a single update as this story develops. Drop a comment below with where you're watching from in this. If you lived through Uri in 2021, or Fern in 2026, or any polar vortex event, how long were you without power, and was your utility prepared? Because those stories are the evidence the regulators don't count. Share this video on X, Facebook, Reddit, or in your group chats. You're the reason we can keep chasing stories like this, so thank you for having our back. Now, here's what this investigation is going to cover. An atmospheric event that happens 32 kilometers above the Arctic, invisible, soundless, detectable only by stratospheric instruments, that can predictably shatter the polar vortex and send sub-zero air into states where building codes, pipelines, and power plants were designed for mild winters. 5 storms in 11 years. Uri, Elliott, Jerry, Heather, Fern. 5 NERC reports. The same 3 failure modes accounting for 96% of every outage across every event. And a natural gas system that feeds 43% of U.S. electricity generation that still has no federal authority requiring it to winterize. And then the current map, 7 specific regions that America's own Grid Reliability Organization has named as at elevated risk when extreme cold hits. Those regions overlap almost exactly with the states that have the least experience with what's coming. Now, let's get into it. On the 5th of March, 2025, something happened 32 kilometers above the Arctic that most people never heard about. There was no explosion, no visible phenomenon, no breaking news alert. What happened was measured in temperature anomalies at a pressure level of 10 hectopascals, a layer of atmosphere so far above daily life that commercial aircraft fly at roughly a quarter of that altitude. What the instruments recorded was a major sudden stratospheric warming event, and the polar vortex that had dominated the northern hemisphere winter of 2024 through 2025 didn't just weaken. It ended abruptly. The NASA Global Modeling and Assimilation Office documented it precisely. A cold, stratospheric polar region had characterized most of that winter, and then a major final warming in early March brought the entire stratospheric polar vortex to a halt. Most people don't track conditions 32 kilometers up. But the people who understand what happens next, in the weeks and months that follow an event like that, have been watching those measurements with growing attention for over a decade. Because what happens in the stratosphere doesn't stay in the stratosphere. The Arctic polar vortex is a band of strong westerly winds that forms in the stratosphere every winter. It circles the pole at roughly 60 degrees north latitude, at altitudes between about 15 and 50 kilometers, spinning counterclockwise with wind speeds that can reach 300 kilometers per hour at peak intensity. Its job, if a band of atmospheric wind can be said to have a job, is to contain, to hold the bitterly cold air of the Arctic inside a spinning ring that isolates it from the warmer atmosphere at lower latitudes. When the vortex is strong and stable, Arctic air stays Arctic. The jet stream stays relatively straight and fast. Temperatures in the mid-latitudes of North America stay within something resembling their historical range. When the vortex disrupts, the containment fails. Lawrence Coy and Paul Newman, atmospheric scientists at NASA's Goddard Space Flight Center, have spent years studying the mechanics of these disruptions. They happen when large-scale atmospheric waves deflare planetary scale, disturbances generated partly by the shape of the terrain below, partly by temperature gradients at the ocean's surface, propagate upward from the troposphere into the stratosphere with enough energy to destabilize the vortex winds. When those waves are strong enough, they break. The westerly winds slow. The temperature gradient that maintain the vortex collapses, and in the most dramatic cases, the stratospheric temperatures over the Arctic can spike 30 to 50 degrees Celsius in a matter of days. Not at the surface. Not where you live. 32 kilometers up, in a layer of atmosphere that most people will never think about. That rapid warming is the sudden stratospheric warming event, the SSW. According to Coy, events like this occur in the Arctic about once every other year on average. Some winters pass without one. Other winters produce multiple warming events, as happened in the winter of 2024 through 2025, which saw a smaller February warming event, followed by the major March event that ended the season entirely. The Antarctic vortex is far more stable. SSW events, they occur roughly once every 5 years, and the consecutive events in July and August 2024 over Antarctica were so unusual they broke records going back to the start of the satellite era in 1979. But here's what matters for this investigation. The stratospheric event isn't the story. The stratospheric event is the warning, because the disruption doesn't stay at altitude, it propagates downward. The weakened vortex couples into the troposphere, the layer of atmosphere where weather actually happens, where you live, where your power grid operates, over a period of 10 to 30 days. This downward coupling mechanism is what connects a temperature spike at the edge of space to a catastrophic cold air outbreak in Texas 3 weeks later. It's what links an instrument reading at 10 hectopascals to a family huddled in a 37-degree apartment in Houston with no power and no heat. The mechanism is specific. The disrupted stratospheric vortex produces what atmospheric scientists call a negative Arctic oscillation, a shift in the large-scale pressure pattern that pushes the polar jet stream into deeply amplified meridional waves. Instead of flowing in a relatively tight band from west to east across the upper latitudes, the jet stream begins to meander dramatically north and south. And when it dips south, when it digs deep into the continental interior of North America, it acts as a highway for Arctic air masses, guiding sub-zero temperatures thousands of miles south of where they belong. In 2021, this is exactly what happened. A sudden stratospheric warming event occurred on January 5th. Amy Butler, a research scientist at NOAA's Physical Sciences Laboratory, described it directly. The polar vortex weakened. It got stretched out of shape and slid southward off the pole. Over the following weeks, the jet stream became wavier. And then, in mid to late February, the southern plains and Gulf Coast experienced a cold air outbreak that was, in Butler's assessment, reasonably linked to that January stratospheric event. Surface temperature anomalies across Texas and the South ran 40 degrees Fahrenheit below the 1981 through 2010 average during the period of February 15th through 22nd. Not 4 degrees, 40 degrees, for a region where building codes, power plants, and natural gas infrastructure were designed around a climate that doesn't produce temperatures like that. The instruments tracked the March 2025 event in real time. NASA's GEOSFP forward processing system, a model that assimilates meteorological data continuously from satellites, aircraft, and ground-based observing stations, detected and tracked the evolving SSW as it developed. The GEOS seasonal to subseasonal forecast system had been flagging the signal weeks in advance. The science of detection has become remarkably precise, and yet NOAA's pre-winter forecast for 2024 through 2025, issued in December 2024, before the events of that winter, had estimated a 55% probability that no sudden stratospheric warming would occur at all. The La Niña conditions and the phase of the quasi-biennial oscillation, a measure of stratospheric wind patterns in the tropics, both historically reduce SSW likelihood. The models gave roughly even odds that the winter would pass without a major vortex disruption. The models were wrong. That error matters not because the forecasters failed. Probabilistic forecasts are not predictions, and a 45% chance of SSW is still substantial. But because it illustrates the fundamental challenge that grid operators face. They know what an SSW does. They know the range of time before its surface effects arrive. What they don't know, with enough precision and enough lead time, is exactly which regions will bear the cold, exactly how cold it will get, and exactly how long it will last. The atmospheric science provides a warning window of 10 to 30 days. The surface weather prediction skill is 7 to 10 days at best. Between the warning and the certainty lies the gap where infrastructure decisions have to be made. The question this investigation is built around is not whether this happens. It happens roughly every other winter, It happened in March 2025. It contributed, in its January 2021 predecessor, to the worst energy infrastructure failure in Texas state history. The question is what the infrastructure looks like when it arrives again. Not all polar vortex disruptions are the same, and the differences matter because different types of disruptions tend to send cold air to different places. Atmospheric scientists distinguish between two primary categories of sudden stratospheric warming. In a displacement event, the vortex is pushed away from its normal position, centered on the pole, but remains largely intact as a single structure. The result is that it migrates toward lower latitudes, sometimes centering over Siberia, sometimes over Canada, sometimes over the northern Atlantic. Where it goes determines which population centers experience the anomalous cold beneath it, because the system drags its pool of Arctic air with it like a slow, massive freight train. In a split event, the vortex fragments. It divides into two or more smaller vortices, each carrying their own pocket of cold air, each migrating in different directions. A split event can simultaneously deliver anomalous cold to Europe and North America. It can produce cold outbreaks across a broader geographic footprint than a displacement event, because there are multiple lobes of cold air moving toward multiple targets. The winter of 2020 to 2021 produced a displacement-type event. The vortex got stretched, not fully split, but elongated southward, with a lobe extending toward North America. A 2025 paper in Science Advances, a peer-reviewed study that analyzed cold air outbreaks in the continental United States in relation to polar stratospheric variability from 1980 through the 2024 to 2025 winter, developed a clustering analysis of polar vortex states. They identified 5 distinct configurations, labeled P1 through P5. P1 represents the strongest, most tightly coupled polar vortex. Cold contained, jet stream steady, mid-latitudes protected. P4 and P5 represent the weakened, displaced, and split configurations associated with SSW events. And what the research found is that extreme stratospheric wave events, including the P4 and P5 configurations, are followed by an increased risk of cold extremes over North America 5 to 25 days later. Not in every case, not with certainty, but with a measurable, statistically significant elevation in probability that lands in a specific geographic footprint, the central and eastern United States. That paper cataloged recent U.S. cold extremes associated with polar vortex disruptions, the winters of 2009 through 10, 2013 through 14, 2014 through 15, 2020 through 21, and 2024 through 2025, 5 events in 15 years. And in each case, the mechanism left a fingerprint in the stratospheric record that preceded it. The 2013 through 2014 polar vortex winter is worth examining specifically because it illustrates something important. That winter, the one that introduced the term polar vortex to the public consciousness, did not actually produce a full sudden stratospheric warming event. There was no classic SSW signature. What happened instead was a repeated stretching of the stratospheric polar vortex, a P3 cluster state in the Science Advances taxonomy, combined with a downward wave reflection that amplified a blocking high near Alaska and drove anomalous cold air south across central North America. The same outcome? A different pathway, which means the full SSW event, with its dramatic reversal of stratospheric winds, is only one of the mechanisms capable of producing what the North American surface ultimately experienced as extreme cold. Jennifer Francis at the Woodwell Climate Research Center, who published what she describes as the first paper to propose in broader terms the impact of Arctic amplification on extreme weather, co-authored with Stephen Vavris of the University of Wisconsin-Madison in a 2012 Geophysical Research Letters paper, has found what she characterizes as robust relationships between Arctic warming and a wavier jet stream. The mechanism she identified is straightforward in its physics. The jet stream is powered by the temperature difference between the Arctic and the mid-latitudes. As the Arctic warms, and it has warmed at roughly 4 times the global average rate since 1979, with some hotspots in the Barents Sea region warming up to 7 times faster, that temperature gradient diminishes. A weaker gradient means weaker jet stream winds. A slower flowing jet stream, like a slow-moving river, tends to meander, and large north-south undulations in the jet stream generate wave energy in the atmosphere. Wave energy that, when large and persistent enough, propagates upward into the stratosphere and can disrupt the polar vortex. This is the proposed connection between a warming Arctic and more frequent or more severe polar vortex disruptions. It is a scientific hypothesis with substantial observational support. It is also a hypothesis that remains actively debated. Amy Butler at NOAA is measured in her assessment of the long-term trend. I don't think there is any convincing evidence of a long-term trend in the polar vortex. She said, "What we see in the record is this very interesting period in the 1990s, when there were no sudden stratospheric warming events observed in the Arctic. In other words, the vortex was strong and stable, but then they started back up again in the late 1990s, and over the next decade there was one almost every year. So there was a window of time in the early 2010s where it seemed like there might be a trend toward weaker, more disrupted states of the Arctic polar vortex. But it hasn't continued, and more it's looking like what seemed to be the beginning of a trend was just natural variability. That honest uncertainty matters. It is why this investigation presents multiple interpretations of the evidence. What is not uncertain is the frequency. Roughly every other winter in the Arctic, on average, an SSW event occurs. Some winters produce none. Some produce several. And the Science Advances 2025 paper is specific about one thing that is confirmed, even in the absence of long-term trend evidence. Extreme winter cold events in the central and eastern United States have not decreased in frequency or intensity despite overall winter warming trends since 1980. The cold isn't going away. The question is whether the infrastructure beneath it is built. For the cold, it still delivers. There's another piece of this that belongs here. The downward coupling from stratosphere to surface takes time, but it doesn't take infinite time. The warming event in the stratosphere is detectable and trackable weeks before the surface impact arrives. A 2025 study published on ArcSiv evaluated an AI-based forecasting model called FMCast, a flow-matching generative model for probabilistic SSW forecasting, against 18 major SSW events from 1998 through 2024. FMCast achieved forecast skill comparable to leading operational models like the European Center for Medium-Range Weather Forecast System up to 15 days in advance. The technology exists to see this coming. The 2-week warning window is real. It exists. It has existed for years. What matters is what happens during those 2 weeks in the infrastructure that will receive the cold when it arrives. And to understand that, you have to start in Texas, February 2021, a night when the margin between a managed crisis and a cascading civilizational failure was 4 minutes and 37 seconds. For the first time in recorded history, all 254 counties in the state of Texas were placed under a winter storm warning simultaneously by the National Weather Service. Not most counties, not a swath across the north. All of them, including counties along the Gulf Coast where the climate is subtropical, including counties that had never in the recorded history experienced temperatures this low for this many consecutive days. The storms arrived in sequence. An ice storm hit on February 10th and 11th. Winter Storm Uri followed on the 13th through the 17th. A third system arrived February 15th through the 20th. The combination pushed temperatures 40 degrees Fahrenheit below normal in parts of central Texas. Temperatures that were not merely uncomfortable. They were outside the design parameters of essentially every piece of critical infrastructure in the state. At 1:25 in the morning, on February 15th, the Electric Reliability Council of Texas, ERCOT, the nonprofit that manages roughly 90% of the state's power grid, initiated rotating outages. The demand for electricity had been climbing for days as people turned up thermostats, ran space heaters, and tried to maintain any warmth in homes that were not designed to retain heat in temperatures this extreme. The peak demand recorded on February 16th reached 76,819 megawatts. That number was 12,329 megawatts, above the grid's current capacity at that moment. It was also higher than any demand the Texas grid had ever seen. But the demand wasn't the catastrophe. The catastrophe was the supply. Over the course of approximately 4 hours on February 15th, 40% of the grid's generating capacity went offline. Not gradually, not in a managed sequence. The failures cascaded, one plant tripping, the next struggling to compensate, the frequency on the grid dropping, automatic protection systems cutting out additional units to prevent equipment damage. The system that was supposed to maintain itself was accelerating its own failure. ERCOT would later reveal what the real-time operators knew in those early morning hours. The Texas grid was 4 minutes and 37 seconds from complete statewide blackout. Not rolling blackouts, not rotating outages. A complete, uncontrolled collapse of the entire interconnected system. An event that, according to grid engineers, could have required not days, but weeks, potentially months, to fully restore. Because restoring a grid from complete collapse is not as simple as flipping switches. It requires a careful, sequential restart of generation, transmission, and distribution, coordinated across hundreds of facilities, starting from a condition of zero power everywhere. 4 minutes and 37 seconds. That is the margin. At its peak, the crisis left 4.5 million homes and businesses without power. The University of Houston surveyed 1,500 Texas residents afterward. The average outage duration was 46 hours. The range ran from 1 hour to 120 hours. Some neighborhoods, particularly lower income communities with less political infrastructure, stayed dark for days after wealthier neighborhoods were restored. The official death toll is 246. That number comes from the Texas Department of State Health Services, and it counts only the deaths, where a medical examiner or coroner explicitly noted the freeze as a cause. Ariel Karlinski, a researcher who serves on the World Health Organization's Technical Advisory Group on COVID-19 mortality, applied excess mortality methodology to the Uri death data. The results suggest the official count is a severe undercount. Heart attacks triggered by the loss of life support systems. Carbon monoxide poisonings classified as natural causes. Hypothermia listed as a complication of an underlying condition. Deaths that the data shows statistically should not have happened in the cold weeks of February 2021, but that the counting methodology doesn't capture. At least 300 cases of carbon monoxide poisoning were reported statewide. People running cars, generators, and gas-powered equipment indoors, trying to generate warmth in any way available to them. Hospitals kept running on backup generators, but vaccine cold chains were disrupted, delaying COVID vaccinations at a moment when the country was just beginning to roll out the shots that would end the pandemic's worst phase. The cold paralyzed roads, preventing utility crews from reaching failed equipment. It paralyzed supply chains, preventing fuel from reaching generators that were still functional. It paralyzed the emergency response infrastructure, which was simultaneously fielding calls about hypothermia, carbon monoxide, pipe bursts, car accidents, and medical equipment failures in homes where the power had been out long enough to drain every battery. The natural gas system failed first, and its failure accelerated everything else. Texas natural gas production fell 45% the week of February 14th, according to data from the Energy Information Administration. That collapse in a single state was large enough to reduce total nationwide natural gas production by 20%. The failure cascaded through the fuel supply chain. Wellheads froze, gathering lines developed blockages, processing plants lost power and went offline. Pipeline pressure dropped, and gas-fired power plants, which, at that time as now, represent the single largest source of electricity generation in Texas, began losing their fuel. A generator that can't get gas can't generate power. And when the generator started failing, the electricity that gas infrastructure equipment needed to keep running its own compressors and controls also failed. The loop closed. The spiral accelerated. What makes this moment in the investigation require pause is the context in which it happened. The federal government had warned Texas about exactly this failure mode. In 2011, a decade before Uri, a Groundhog Day blizzard hit the state and produced rolling blackouts across more than 75% of Texas. The North American Electric Reliability Corporation and the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission issued a 357-page report in August 2011. The report identified the same vulnerabilities that would cause Uri a decade later: inadequate weatherization of natural gas infrastructure, power plants operating too close to their cold weather limits, insufficient coordination between gas and electric systems. The report made specific recommendations. Texas received them. Texas's grid operators acknowledged them. And then, because no regulatory authority could compel implementation, and because winterization costs money, that Texas's deregulated energy market provided no mechanism to recover, the recommendations were not implemented. Rich Glick, who would become FARC chairman during the Uri aftermath, said in the November 2021 final report, "The devastating effects of extreme cold on our bulk power system's ability to operate in 2011 and now 2021 must not be allowed to happen again." It was allowed to happen again. 19 months after FERC Chairman Rich Glick said those words, 19 months after the November 2021 final report on Winter Storm Uri, FERC Commissioner Mark Christie said 4 words that captured the entire pattern of the previous 11 years more accurately than any technical document could. It's déjà vu all over again. It was September 2023. FERC and NERC staff were presenting preliminary findings on Winter Storm Elliott, the Christmas 2022 storm that had produced the largest controlled firm load shed in the history of the Eastern Interconnection. And the numbers they were presenting were, in a specific and measurable sense, worse than Uri. During Winter Storm Elliott, which ran December 21st through December 26th of 2022, 1,702 individual generating units experienced 3,565 outages, derates, or failures to start. 825 of those units were natural gas-fired generators, the single fuel type that dominates the American electricity system. At the worst point of the storm, 90,500 megawatts of generation failed simultaneously. That is a number worth holding for a moment. 90,500 megawatts. That represented 13% of the entire generating capacity of the Eastern Interconnection, the grid system covering roughly 2/3 of the continental United States, and it was 40% more than the generation lost during Winter Storm Uri in Texas. FERC and NERC staff presented one finding from the Elliott inquiry that stopped the room. Among all the generating units that experienced failures due to freezing issues during the storm, the units where the direct cause of failure was identified as cold temperatures acting on equipment, nearly 80% failed at ambient temperatures that were above their own documented minimum operating temperatures. Their own engineering specifications said they should still be running. The cold hadn't exceeded their design limits. The cold was within range, and the equipment failed anyway. Keel Lyons, NERC's senior manager for compliance assurance, presented this finding. The implication is not subtle. It means that the documented minimum operating temperatures on file for those generators were wrong, not slightly off. Wrong, in a way that produced failure rates approaching 80% among the units affected by freezing. The gap between what the equipment was supposed to tolerate and what it actually tolerated was not a rounding error. It was a systematic misrepresentation of reliability embedded in the operating documentation of hundreds of generating units across the Eastern Interconnection. The natural gas system, again, was the first link in the failure chain. Marcellus shale gas production, centered in Pennsylvania, West Virginia, and New York, declined 23% during Elliott. The Utica shale, concentrated in Ohio and West Virginia, declined 54%. Pipeline pressures dropped across the Northeast. David Huff at FERC's Electric Reliability Office reported that Consolidated Edison's natural gas utility, the system serving Manhattan, the Bronx, and parts of Queens, was on the verge of a system collapse on December the 24th due to low pipeline pressure. New York City's gas supply nearly failed on Christmas Eve. NERC CEO Jim Robb noted the stakes plainly. Had the weather not warmed up on Christmas Day, it is highly likely that natural gas service would have been disrupted to New York City. The weather warmed up. The city was spared, not because the infrastructure held, because a warm front arrived before the system finished collapsing. Additionally, 154 Black Start units, the specialized generators designed specifically to restart the grid after a widespread collapse, faced outages during Elliott. 119 of them were gas-fired. The generators designed to save the system in a catastrophic failure were, in large numbers, themselves failing in the conditions that would trigger a catastrophic failure. 167 pages, 11 recommendations. That is the FERC-NERC final report on Winter Storm Elliott, released November 7, 2023. The same recommendations appeared in the 2021 Uri report. The same failure modes were identified. The same gap, no federal authority to enforce winterization standards for the upstream natural gas system, was named again as the unresolved structural problem. Willie Phillips, FERC chairman at the time, said it with the quiet exasperation of someone who had delivered the same message before. Someone, it doesn't have to be FERC, must have authority to establish and enforce natural gas reliability standards. That authority does not exist as of April 2026. And then, in January 2026, Winter Storm Fern arrived. The Weather Channel named it unofficially. It stretched over 2,000 miles. From the Four Corners region to the state of Maine, from January 22nd through January 27th. It brought temperatures as low as negative 43 degrees Fahrenheit. It left over 1 million utility customers without power at its peak, the number still sitting around 700,000 as of January the 26th. 24 governors declared states of emergency. 230 million people, approximately two-thirds of the United States population, were under winter weather alerts of some kind. Over 11,000 flights were canceled, making it the worst day for aviation disruptions since March 30th, 2020, at the height of the COVID-19 pandemic. More than 50 people died. Here is the critical point about Fern in the context of this investigation. It was not a polar vortex SSW event on the scale of Uri. Fern was driven primarily by a powerful surface pressure system, not by a major stratospheric disruption, of the magnitude that produced the February 22 Radi 21 Southern Plains outbreak. Its generation impacts were primarily distribution failures, ice accumulating on trees and power lines, snapping them, rather than the catastrophic generation collapse that Uri produced. 1 million customers lost power in Fern's distribution system failures, with sub-Uri scale cold and without a major generation collapse. The investigation holds that number and asks the question it demands. What does the simultaneous overlay of Fern's distribution failures with Uri's generation failures look like? What happens when the ice takes down the distribution system at the same moment that the gas freeze-offs take down the generation system? Because those two failure modes don't require the same triggering event. A major SSW-driven cold outbreak can produce both simultaneously, and that particular combination is exactly what the atmospheric science says should be expected, roughly every other winter, in the regions that are already named on NERC's risk map. To understand why this keeps happening, you have to understand one specific physical and economic relationship that sits at the center of every winter grid failure this investigation has documented. Natural gas is the dominant fuel of the American electrical grid. As of 2024, it provides 43% of U.S. electricity generation, more than any other single source. Gas-fired generating capacity grew from 508.2 gigawatts in mid-2016 to 564.2 gigawatts in mid-2023, an 11% increase in just 7 years. Over the past 2 decades, gas-fired power generation has doubled. The grid and the gas system have become, in the language of FERC-NERC reports, deeply interdependent. The word interdependent doesn't fully capture what this means during an extreme cold event. What it means operationally is a feedback loop, a death spiral. It works like this. Extreme cold arrives. Residential heating demand spikes simultaneously as electricity demand spikes, both from electric heating and from the additional draw of heated spaces struggling to maintain temperature in poorly insulated buildings. Gas demand surges in 2 directions at once. pipeline gas flowing to homes and businesses for direct heating, and gas flowing to generating stations to produce the electricity that's powering everything else. Meanwhile, upstream, the gas production system is being hit by the same cold that's driving the demand spike. Wellheads at gas production sites are mechanical systems with valves, gauges, separators, and flow lines that contain water vapor along with the natural gas. When temperatures fall, that water vapor condenses and freezes. A freeze-off is exactly what it sounds like: ice blocking the flow of gas from the well. The Texas Railroad Commission's own best practices report describes what follows. The natural gas industry depends on electric utilities to power the instrumentation, compression, pumps, and processing equipment that help move gas from the production fields to end users. Gas processing plants, compressor stations, and gathering systems all require electricity to operate. So, cold temperatures reduce gas production at wellheads. Cold temperatures simultaneously increase electricity demand. Gas-fired generators increase their draw on the pipeline system. Pipeline pressure begins to drop. Gas-fired generators start losing fuel. The generators begin tripping offline. The grid loses generation's capacity. Rolling blackouts begin. Electric power to compressor stations and gas processing equipment is interrupted or curtailed, which reduces gas pressure further, which causes more gas-fired generators to trip offline. The loop doesn't require any single catastrophic failure. It requires only that the rate of deterioration on one side exceed the capacity for compensation on the other. Uri demonstrated this at the level of the entire Texas gas and electric system. Elliott demonstrated it at the level of a near collapse of New York City's gas supply. Wood Mackenzie, the energy research firm, documented the January 2026 cold weather event, the storms leading into and around Winter Storm Fern, with real-time data. Their estimate of freeze-off impacts reached 13.5 billion cubic feet per day. The cumulative freeze-off for the 2025 through 2026 winter season reached 58.3 billion cubic feet by late January. Randall Collum Jr., Wood Mackenzie's senior vice president, reported that pipe nominations were adjusted downward across nearly all pipelines. The NG3 pipeline, seeing reductions of approximately 585 million cubic feet per day. The Tiger pipeline declining by approximately 365 million cubic feet per day. Multiple pipelines issued underperformance notices, and this happened during Fern, a storm that, as noted, did not produce a major SSW-driven generations collapse. This was the freeze-off behavior for a substantial but sub-maximum cold event. The question this data raises is what the freeze-off numbers look like during a full polar vortex cold outbreak across the Haynesville, Permian, and Appalachian production regions simultaneously. NERC's own 2025 through 2026 Winter Reliability Assessment uses language that is precise in ways that should be read carefully. Natural gas infrastructure freeze protection. Mitigations are voluntary for the natural gas industry in most of North America. Texas is an exception. That sentence, buried in a technical reliability assessment, is describing something with major consequences. The primary fuel for 43% of American electricity generation has no mandatory winterization requirement anywhere in the United States except Texas. And Texas only adopted its standards after Uri killed 246 confirmed people and came within 4 minutes and 37 seconds of a complete statewide grid collapse. Matthew Ketchke, the president of Con Edison's New York area electric utility, the operator that came close to a Manhattan gas system collapse on Christmas Eve 2022, has been direct about the ongoing risk. These very cold events are impactful in being able to maintain continuity of energy supply. I think this is critical. It's part of our job as utility producers just to make sure we can do that for the citizens we serve. Con Edison, after its Christmas 2022 near miss, switched its Manhattan steam and power plant over to oil as a backup fuel. One utility in one city made one adaptation. The systemic gap, the voluntary gas winterization, the absence of federal authority remains. NERC's 2024 Long-Term Reliability Assessment, released December 2024, is direct about where the trajectory of these two trends, growing winter demand and gas system vulnerabilities, is heading. The future electricity supply will come from a resource mix that is more variable, weather-dependent, and reliant on natural gas for fuel, requiring broad coordination and careful attention to manage. More reliant on natural gas. More weather-dependent, in a system where gas winterization is voluntary. The compound feedback loop is documented. The regulatory gap is documented. The trajectory is documented. What isn't fully documented, what the next section of this investigation turns to, is the current geographic map of where the risk is concentrated. Because NERC has named names, it has put specific regions on a risk list. And those regions are the regions that have the least experience with what this loop produces when it runs to completion. NERC, the North American Electric Reliability Corporation, is not a sensationalist organization. It is the body charged by the federal government with ensuring the reliability of the bulk power system across the United States and Canada. Its assessments are written in the measured language of engineering risk analysis, with probabilistic frameworks and reserve margin calculations and carefully hedged technical conclusions. It does not issue warnings lightly. In November 2025, NERC released its 2025 through 2026 Winter Reliability Assessment. The document runs dozens of pages, covers every major grid region in North America, and establishes the baseline finding that all assessed areas have adequate resources for normal winter peak load conditions. That is the headline. That is what gets reported when it gets reported at all. Buried inside that same document, not hidden, just requiring that you read it, is the list of regions that are not adequate in conditions that are not normal. The conditions that are not normal are precisely the conditions that a major polar vortex SW event produces. Extreme cold extending over a wide geographic area, simultaneously reducing generator performance, driving demand above forecast levels, and stressing natural gas supply infrastructure. Under those conditions, NERC identifies 7 regions facing potential electricity supply shortfalls: NPCC Maritimes, the Canadian Maritimes, NPCC New England, SRC East, the Southeast, including the Carolinas and surrounding states, SRC Central, Tennessee, Mississippi, Alabama and the surrounding region, Texas, RE ERCOT, WECC Basin, the Interior West, and WECC Northwest. Look at that list. The Southeast, Texas. These are the regions. These are the states where, in February 2021, 246 people died, where in January 2026, over 1 million homes lost power in a storm that was not even a full polar vortex event. These are the regions with the least cold weather grid experience, the least cold weather building stock, and the populations that are most dependent on continuous power, because they have the fewest alternatives. And this is where the investigation takes a turn that most coverage of this topic has missed, because the elevated risk in CERC East, the Southeast, isn't simply the product of old vulnerabilities left unaddressed. Something has structurally changed about the Southeast grid over the past decade that makes it more vulnerable in extreme winter conditions now than it was during Uri, not less. CERC East used to be a summer peaking region. Its grid was engineered around the assumption that maximum demand would arrive on the hottest days of summer, when air conditioners ran full blast across the Carolinas and Georgia and Tennessee. Winter demand was lower. Winter reliability planning was built around a smaller peak, but over the past several years, 2 simultaneous trends have shifted that. First, the explosive growth of solar photovoltaic generation across the Southeast has fundamentally changed the summer demand curve. Solar panels generate power during the sunniest hours, the same hours when summer air conditioning demand peaks. Solar shaves the summer peak load. CERC East's summer peak, relative to available resources, has become more manageable. Second, electrification of heating is driving up winter demand. As heat pumps replace gas furnaces and oil boilers, as new construction increasingly specifies electric heating, as utilities in some cases actively encourage the switch. The winter electricity load in the southeast has been climbing. CERC East has quietly transitioned from a summer peaking region to what NERC's assessments now call a dual-season peaking region, a region with roughly equivalent summer and winter peak demands. But here's the vulnerability this creates. Solar generates almost nothing at 8 o'clock in the morning in January. The sun isn't up yet, or barely, and 8 o'clock in the morning in January is exactly when winter heating demand peaks. The overnight cold requiring maximum heating effort at dawn. The CERC 2024 Long-Term Reliability Assessment, which analyzed resource adequacy for the years 2026 and 2028 using 38 years of historical weather data, found that CERC East faces some risk of load loss, specifically during winter morning hours around 8 a.m. The risk is concentrated in January and February. The probabilistic analysis for 2026 found an annual expected unserved energy of 143.35 megawatt hours, a small number in isolation, but one that exists specifically because of this gap between peak demand timing and solar availability. And that assessment didn't include the scenario of extreme cold affecting a wide geographic footprint, which eliminates the import option. This is the key point about the wide area event. NERC's standard mitigation for a region facing a local supply shortfall is imports from neighboring grid regions. Buy power from someone who has surplus. But a major SSW-driven cold outbreak doesn't hit one region. It hits a broad swath of the continental interior simultaneously. When CERC East needs imports during a wide area polar vortex event, the regions it would import from are experiencing the same cold. Those regions are simultaneously managing their own demand spikes and generation losses. The mutual aid system that functions as the safety valve during geographically limited events doesn't function during a wide area event. This is explicitly acknowledged by NERC. For extreme cold weather events that might impact a wide geographical footprint, there is also a limit on imports from neighboring areas. ERCOT, Texas's independent grid, has run its own probabilistic assessment. For the January peak load day, the highest risk winter day, ERCOT estimates a 2% probability of having to declare an energy emergency alert and a 1.8% controlled load shed probability. Those numbers sound small, but ERCOT is the grid that was 4 minutes and 37 seconds from collapse in 2021, and those probabilities apply to a single average winter day, not to the sustained multi-day extreme cold that a major polar vortex outbreak produces. A multi-day extreme cold event shifts those probability distributions significantly. There is also a pipeline issue in New England that belongs in this map. On July 30th, 2024, the U.S. Court of Appeals for the D.C. Circuit overturned FERC's approval of the Williams Company's Regional Energy Access Project, a pipeline expansion that had been operating to increase gas delivery capacity to New Jersey by 829 million cubic feet per day. With that project in legal jeopardy, the region faces the risk of requiring more gas for electric reliability than is available within existing and planned pipeline capacity during peak demand. New England, which already competed with Europe and Asia for liquefied natural gas imports even before this development, now faces an additional supply constraint. The Algonquin Citygate hub near Boston, the pricing benchmark for New England gas, is forecast to average $12.76 per million. BTU for winter 2025 through 2026, the highest price of any major hub in the country. These 7 regions, these specific vulnerabilities. This is what NERC has named, in writing in November 2025, for the winter that just passed and the winters ahead. There is a certain kind of authority that comes from understanding exactly how we know what we know. Not just what the data says, but what produced the data. What instrument collected it? What physics it is measuring? How confident we should be in the measurement and what its limitations are. This matters for this investigation because the science of detecting and forecasting polar vortex disruptions is, in fact, remarkably well developed. And understanding its precision helps clarify where the failure in the system actually lies. It doesn't lie in our inability to see the event coming. NASA's Global Modeling and Assimilation Office operates the GEOS-FP system, the Goddard Earth Observing System Forward Processing Model. It is a real-time meteorological data assimilation system that ingests observations from satellites, aircraft instrumentation, and ground-based observing networks continuously. The GEOS-FP model runs at high spatial resolution and produces analysis fields that represent the best estimate of the current state of the atmosphere across all relevant variables: temperature, wind, humidity, pressure from the surface up through the stratosphere. It was the GEOS-FP and the companion GEOC seasonal to subseasonal forecast system, GEOC S2S, that tracked the March 2025 SSW event in real time as it developed, providing the documentation that confirmed the major final warming. The diagnostic variable that atmospheric scientists use to characterize the polar vortex's state is Ertel potential vorticity, EPV. It's a quantity that describes how air masses are spinning, and it is what's known as a conserved tracer. It follows the motion of the air almost perfectly, allowing scientists to track air mass origins and movement across time and distance. High EPV values, shown in the NASA GMAO visualizations as yellow regions, indicate clockwise circulation. Arctic air, rotating in the characteristic polar vortex pattern. Low EPV regions indicate counterclockwise circulation. Tropical or mid-latitude air. The visualization of EPV fields at 7 hectopascals for February 1st, 2025, before the major disruption, shows the polar vortex as a relatively coherent yellow structure centered near the pole. The same visualization for March 31st, 2025, shows the result of the major final warming. The vortex structure fragmented, the EPV field transformed. Between those two images is the entire story of the March 2025 SSW. What's important to understand about these observations is that they aren't just retrospective documentation. The signals that precede an SSW are detectable in the observational record days to weeks before the vortex actually collapses. NASA's documentation of the March 2025 event notes the specific precursor, the tropospheric incursion under the stratospheric vortex near Greenland that precipitated the smaller February warming event. A tropospheric incursion, a push of lower atmosphere air up into the stratospheric layer, is one of the physical signatures that precedes vortex disruption. The instruments see it, the models capture it. The FMCAS system, a flow matching based generative AI model for probabilistic SSW forecasting, SAT, published on ArXiv in October 2025, evaluated its performance against 18 major SSW events from 1998 through 2024. The results showed that FMCAS successfully forecast the onset, intensity, and three-dimensional morphology of the polar vortex up to 15 days in advance for most cases, with performance comparable to or exceeding the ECMWF, the European Center for Medium-Range Weather Forecasts, one of the world's leading operational numerical weather prediction systems. And it generates a 30-day forecast with 50 ensemble members, 50 different possible futures, in approximately 2 minutes on a consumer graphics processing unit. The computational barrier to stratospheric forecasting has essentially been removed. The QBO, the quasi-biennial oscillation, is measured through radiosondes, weather balloons carrying temperature, pressure, humidity, and wind sensors, released from specific tropical stations. Since 1975, the data has been compiled primarily from Singapore, maintained by the Freie Universität Berlin, and supplemented from NASA's QBO website. This seemingly simple measurement, zonal wind speed in the tropical stratosphere, is one of the primary inputs to SSW probability forecasting, because the phase of the QBO significantly modulates how easily large planetary waves can penetrate the stratosphere and disrupt the polar vortex. The science connects measurements from a weather balloon in Singapore to probability estimates for extreme cold in Mississippi, Texas, and the Carolinas. This is the state of the detection technology. The ability to see a major polar vortex disruption forming, to track its evolution in real time, and to forecast its onset up to 15 days in advance has been established and is improving. The warning window exists, but there is an important limitation that the same research community is candid about. The 15-day stratospheric forecast window does not translate directly into a 15-day surface weather forecast. The stratospheric event, the warming, the vortex collapse, can be predicted with meaningful skill at 15 days. But the surface response, exactly which regions experience the cold, exactly how cold it gets, exactly how long it persists, depends on the behavior of the troposphere in those weeks, and tropospheric predictability degrades substantially beyond 7 to 10 days. FMCast researchers identify this explicitly, noting distinct predictability regimes, events driven by continuous wave forcing versus those governed by an initial trigger and subsequent stratospheric dynamical memory. What this means practically, grid operators and emergency managers will know, roughly 2 weeks out, that a major SSW has occurred or is occurring, and that elevated risk of cold air outbreaks in the mid-latitudes is coming. They will know, with a week's warning, approximately where the cold air is going. They will have 5 to 7 days to know how cold and how long. In a system with adequate winterization, adequate fuel reserves, and adequate coordination between the gas and electric systems, a week is meaningful. In a system where gas winterization is voluntary and upstream, producers haven't demonstrably improved their cold weather readiness. Where generators fail at temperatures above their own documented minimums, the difference between a 1-week warning and a 10-minute warning may not matter as much as the regulator who receives it would prefer to believe. The instruments work, the forecasting works. The gap in this system is not in our ability to see it coming. There's a number in NERC's 2025 through 2026 Winter Reliability Assessment that deserves more attention than it typically receives. Winter electricity demand for the bulk power system is forecast to increase by 20.2 gigawatts over the prior winter's forecast. That's a 2.5% increase in a single year. NERC's own characterization, the fastest rate in recent years. And the assessment flags that BA operators are likely to face higher winter demand without a comparable increase in supply resources. More demand, not enough more supply. This number is the product of 2 simultaneous structural shifts that have been quietly reshaping the American grid's vulnerability profile during winter. The first is the electrification of heating. The second is the data center boom. Together, they're increasing winter electricity demand at rates that dispatchable generation. The generators that can produce power on demand, regardless of weather, is not keeping pace with. The electrification of heating story has a specific geography. Heat pumps, which extract thermal energy from the outside air and pump it indoors, have been growing rapidly as a technology, particularly in the mild climate states of the Southeast, where they are more efficient than in deeply cold climates. A heat pump that works efficiently at 40 degrees Fahrenheit works considerably harder at 15 degrees and may switch to emergency electric resistance heating, essentially a giant toaster element when temperatures fall below its operating threshold. Electric resistance heating uses roughly 3 times as much electricity per unit of heat as a heat pump operating efficiently. A cold snap that pushes temperatures below heat pump operating thresholds doesn't just increase heating demand, it increases it non-linearly at the worst possible moment. The data center growth is a different driver, but it points in the same direction. NERC's assessment explicitly calls out data center development as a primary driver of accelerated electricity demand growth, particularly in areas like CERC East and the PJM region. Data centers run continuously, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, at a relatively fixed power draw that doesn't flex with weather. They add a growing baseline of winter load on top of the weather-driven heating load. Meanwhile, the resource mix that is growing fastest to meet this demand, battery storage and solar photovoltaic, has characteristics that create specific vulnerabilities in extreme winter conditions. Solar generates essentially zero power before sunrise and operates at reduced efficiency in cold, overcast winter conditions. NERC's 2025 assessment notes this directly. Battery energy storage is reliable when it can be dispatched and has sufficient charge for the period it is needed, yet little time to recharge can be expected during extreme winter weather. A battery system that discharges during the morning demand peak may not recover its charge before the evening peak, not because the technology has failed, but because the solar and wind conditions of a cold winter day don't provide the generation needed to recharge it. The type of generation that is not growing to match the demand increase is dispatchable thermal generation, natural gas, nuclear, and coal. Generator retirements are accelerating as older plants close, and the replacement resources are overwhelmingly variable renewables and storage. NERC's 2024 Long-Term Reliability Assessment, published in December 2024, found that over half of North America faces risk of energy shortfalls over the next 10 years, driven by the combination of growing demand and accelerating generator retirements, creating a growing gap in dispatchable capacity. CERC East's transformation from a summer peaking to a dual season peaking region captures all of these trends in one place. The Southeast is electrifying heating. It is adding data centers. It is adding solar and storage. And it is sitting in the middle of the geographic zone that polar vortex cold outbreaks reliably hit. The Center for American Progress documented the rate of change in winter weather stress. Cold, weather-related power outages increased 97% from the 2014 through 2023 period compared to the 2000 through 2013 period. That is not a marginal uptick. That is a near doubling of cold weather outage frequency in a decade. The price signal is also worth noting. Households paid 9.6% more on average in 2025 than in 2024 for electricity, outpacing both wage growth and overall inflation. The grid is simultaneously becoming less reliable in extreme conditions and more expensive in normal ones. The populations in the regions at elevated risk are the ones spending a larger share of income on utilities and are the ones with the least capacity to invest in backup heating, backup generation, or the rapid relocation that more mobile populations can consider when a storm is forecast. The structural shift has a political economy component that has nothing to do with conspiracy and everything to do with incentives. The Texas grid's deregulated market structure, intentionally disconnected from neighboring states to avoid federal oversight, created a system in which winterization costs could not be reliably recovered through electricity prices. Power generators in a competitive market face a choice. Spend money on weatherization that improves reliability in events that happen roughly every decade, or don't spend that money and be price competitive in the years in between. The market structure rewarded the choice not to winterize. Texas's Public Utility Commission eliminated its oversight and enforcement division months before Uri. These are not hidden facts. They are documented in the public record. The structural shift in demand, combined with the structural gap in gas winterization, combined with the geographic concentration of elevated risk in the least prepared regions, these three elements don't each independently create catastrophe. They create catastrophe when they converge. And the atmospheric mechanism that forces convergence is operating on a schedule of roughly every other winter. Natural gas is not a simple substance. It is a mixture of hydrocarbons, primarily methane, with ethane, propane, butane, and other components. And it contains something that creates significant operational problems in cold weather: water vapor. Water is present in the gas stream from the moment it leaves the reservoir rock underground. Even after processing, residual moisture remains in the distribution pipeline system. And when temperatures fall, and when pressure conditions change in ways that lower the dew point of the gas mixture, that moisture doesn't stay as vapor, it condenses. And then, in sufficiently cold conditions, it freezes. A freeze-off is what happens when ice forms inside a pipeline, a valve, a wellhead component, or a gathering line, and blocks the flow of gas. The blockage can be partial, reducing flow and dropping pipeline pressure. It can be complete, stopping flow entirely. And depending on where in the supply chain the freeze-off occurs, its effects can cascade dramatically. The Pipeline and Hazardous Materials Safety Administration, PHMSA, has collected failure data for natural gas distribution pipeline operations in the United States since 1984. Reviewing incidents through mid-2014, frost heave, the mechanical ground movement caused by water freezing in soil beneath buried pipes, was identified as the cause of 82% of all cold weather damage incidents. The second leading cause was snow accumulation or movement, accounting for 11%. These are not exotic failure modes. They are the predictable physical responses of infrastructure to conditions it wasn't designed to handle. Prevention of freeze-offs is technically straightforward. Producers inject methanol or glycol into the gas stream to lower the freezing point of residual water, preventing ice formation. They install pipe insulation with built-in heating cables. They use compressors and machinery in enclosures or underground to avoid direct cold air exposure. They deploy air dryers to remove moisture before it enters critical components. They use portable heaters and line thawing equipment for emergencies. These are all established technologies. None of them require scientific breakthrough. What they require is investment, planning, and maintenance programs that are established before the cold arrives, because by the time temperatures drop, it's too late to implement them. Here is the critical structural problem. Gas production facilities need electricity to run the equipment that prevents freeze-offs, the heating cables, the compressors, the controls. And when the grid goes down because gas generation is failing due to freeze-offs, the prevention equipment loses power. The Texas Railroad Commission's Best Practices Report describes the circularity explicitly. Rolling electric blackouts or customer curtailments that can shut down electric pumping units or compressors on gathering lines may also result in prolonged gas production reduction. Loss of electricity for gas infrastructure, reduced gas supply, reduced electricity generation, more electricity curtailment, more gas infrastructure goes offline. The spiral has a clear physical basis. It is not a design flaw in any individual piece of equipment. It is a system design flaw in the interface between two critical infrastructure systems that depend on each other in ways that create catastrophic feedback loops when extreme cold hits them simultaneously. Wood Mackenzie's real-time tracking of the January 2026 cold weather events demonstrates what this looks like in the current operational environment. Their freeze-off estimates for January 25th reach levels requiring immediate upward revision, with North Louisiana alone seeing estimates increase by approximately 3 billion cubic feet per day, as temperatures at Shreveport reached a high of only 28 degrees Fahrenheit and a low of 21 degrees, following hailing conditions the day before. Pipe nominations, the scheduled volumes that shippers commit to moving through specific pipelines on a given day, were adjusted downward across nearly all major pipelines in the affected region. The NG3 pipeline saw a reduction of 585 million cubic feet per day. The Tiger pipeline declined by 365 million cubic feet per day. Gulf Run, Tiger, and TETCO each issued underperformance notices. And Randall Collum, Wood Mackenzie's senior vice president, noted the storage dimension that makes this more complicated than a simple production problem. While we theoretically have enough gas in underground storage to meet these supply shortfalls, these shortfalls can exceed what the market can withdraw from storage in a single day in some regions. Underground storage is the backup, but it's not infinitely accessible. The rates at which gas can be withdrawn from storage are constrained by the physical properties of the reservoir and the delivery infrastructure. When production collapses and demand spikes, the storage system may theoretically contain enough gas, but be unable to deliver it fast enough to prevent pressure drops in the pipeline network. This is the deliverability problem. It's not a shortage of molecules. It's a shortage of flow rate when the infrastructure is under maximum stress. The regulatory situation governing all of this is documented with unmistakable clarity in NERC's own assessments. The 2025 through 2026 Winter Reliability Assessment, Natural Gas Infrastructure Freeze Protection. Mitigations are voluntary for the natural gas industry in most of North America. Texas is an exception, where the Railroad Commission of Texas adopted rules. FERC Chairman Willie Phillips, in multiple public statements and official reports. Someone must have authority to establish and enforce natural gas reliability standards, and some recommendations from the 2021 Uri report are still not implemented. The FERC-NERC joint report following Winter Storm Elliott called for congressional action to establish reliability rules for natural gas infrastructure. No such legislation has passed. The National Association of Regulatory Utility Commissioners launched a Gas Electric Alignment for Reliability Task Force, GEAR, in 2024. NERC continues to call for coordination. The gap between calling for authority and possessing it remains open. What sits in that gap is the fuel that 43% of American electricity depends on. In most of the country, outside Texas, there is no regulator with the legal authority to require a natural gas producer to winterize their wellhead equipment. There is no penalty for freeze-offs that take pipeline pressure below what gas-fired generators need to keep the lights on. The system runs on voluntary compliance and market incentives that, as Texas demonstrated at a cost of 246 confirmed deaths and tens of billions of dollars in damage, are insufficient when extreme cold arrives. Everything documented in this investigation so far, the stratospheric physics, the reliability assessments, the generation megawatt numbers, the pipeline pressure measurements, has a translation. It translates into what happens inside a house when the power goes out and the temperature outside is 12 degrees Fahrenheit and the temperature inside begins to fall. The University of Houston's Hobby School of Public Affairs and UH Energy surveyed 1,500 Texas residents in May 2021, 3 months after Uri. The sample was representative of the state's demographics, and it asked people to describe their experience. 68% reported having their power interrupted. Of those who lost power, the average outage lasted 46 hours. The range was 1 hour to 120 hours, 5 full days without electricity in some of the coldest temperatures Texas had experienced in a century. 46 hours. Think about what 46 hours without electricity means in 12-degree weather. The first few hours, the house retains some heat. Modern construction has enough insulation that the initial temperature drop is slow. But in a home built to Texas code, designed to exclude heat in summer, not retain it in winter, the thermal mass runs out. By hour 12, the interior temperature in a poorly insulated home has fallen below 50 degrees. By hour 24, it may be in the 30s. By hour 46, the indoor temperature in some homes approached outdoor temperature, which is why a 60-year-old man with a learning disability died in his apartment near Houston. When his family found him, the temperature in his apartment was 37 degrees Fahrenheit. The official death toll from Winter Storm Uri is 246, but the counting methodology matters. The Texas Department of State Health Services counted only those deaths where the medical examiner or coroner explicitly noted that the freeze caused or contributed to the death. Ariel Karlinski, a researcher who serves on the World Health Organization's Technical Advisory Group on COVID-19 mortality, and who studies what he calls excess mortality. Deaths that statistically should not have occurred, analyzed the Uri data. His conclusion, the official count, is a severe undercount. A heart attack in a 60-degree apartment can be listed as natural causes. Carbon monoxide poisoning from a generator running in a garage might be classified under a different cause code. An elderly person who dies of pneumonia 3 weeks after hypothermia exposure may not be linked to the storm. The official count captures the deaths the system was designed to count. It does not capture the deaths the storm actually caused. Nearly 2/3 of the officially counted deaths were from hypothermia, direct cold exposure. 148 deaths were directly caused by the storm. 92 were classified as indirect. At least 300 cases of carbon monoxide poisoning were reported across the state, from people running generators indoors, running cars in attached garages, using propane heaters in closed spaces, burning charcoal inside. These are the survival behaviors of people who are cold and terrified and have run out of safe options. The water system failure compounded the crisis. When indoor temperatures fall below 32 degrees Fahrenheit, water in pipes freezes. Water expands when it freezes. Pipes burst. In Texas, where homes were not built with pipe insulation or heat tape, because why would they be in a subtropical climate, pipe failures were widespread. Burst pipes produce flooding that causes water damage, and then when the pipe is no longer moving water, produces loss of water service entirely. Boil water advisories spread across the state as water treatment plants lost power and could no longer reliably treat the municipal supply. A significant portion of Texas's population during Uri had no heat, no electricity, and no safe drinking water simultaneously. Roads were impassable, iced over, with utility crews unable to reach failed infrastructure even if they had replacements ready. Emergency services were simultaneously fielding calls about hypothermia, carbon monoxide, flooding, car accidents on iced roads, and medical equipment failures in homes where the power had been out long enough to drain oxygen, concentrators, home ventilators, and dialysis equipment batteries. Hospitals kept running on backup generators, but their backup power has limits. COVID vaccine cold chains were disrupted. Vaccinations were delayed in facilities that couldn't maintain cold storage for the shots. The pandemic response, already stressed, had to pause for a weather event. Manjula Shah, an 85-year-old woman in Texas, developed hypothermia in the cold and was rushed to the hospital. It was too late. Her daughters told the Texas Standard that their mother's husband, Lalji, died 4 months and 5 days later. He didn't meet the criteria for the state's official death count. Neither did hundreds of other Texans whose deaths were connected to the storm through chains of causation. The counting methodology wasn't designed to follow. Winter Storm Fern, in January 2026, produced a smaller version of the same human pattern in the same geography. 6 people died in South Carolina from the ice and cold, 2 in Lawrence County, an 85-year-old man and a 91-year-old woman, both from hypothermia, a 59-year-old man in Charleston County, an 83-year-old woman in Lexington County, a 96-year-old woman in Greenwood County, a 79-year-old man in Oconee County died in a slip and fall accident. Carbon monoxide poisoning cases were reported across multiple states as people ran generators and heaters in closed spaces. 3 young brothers in Texas died after falling through ice on a pond. Fern's generation impact was primarily distribution. Ice on trees, lines coming down. It produced those deaths with sub-Uri scale, cold intensity, and without a major gas production collapse. The human consequence of a full polar vortex SSW event with Uri scale generation failure layered on top of Fern scale distribution failure is not a hypothetical. It is a scalar extension of events that are directly documented. There is a document that sits in the National Archives, or rather, a version of it does, that tells this story in miniature. In August 2011, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission issued a 357-page report on the consequences of the Groundhog Day blizzard of February 2011. That storm had produced rolling blackouts across more than 75% of Texas. The FERC report identified the specific vulnerabilities in the natural gas system and the power generation fleet that caused the failures. It made specific recommendations about weatherization. It recommended that state regulators and grid operators implement those recommendations before the next cold weather event. The next cold weather event arrived 10 years later. It was Uri. This is not the first time in this investigation the number 15 years has appeared. The pattern of warnings and non-response extends back to December 1989, an extreme cold event in Texas that prompted similar recommendations about winterization of gas and electric infrastructure. Those recommendations were also not implemented. What we have then is a 32-year documented chain of warning, acknowledgement, and inaction. 3 cold events, 3 rounds of federal recommendations, 3 rounds of insufficient response, and then Uri. After Uri, the regulatory response was more aggressive. NRC and FERC pursued new reliability standards, specifically aimed at cold weather preparedness. The first set of standards was approved in August 2021, before the final Uri report was even complete. In February 2023, the Commission approved Cold Weather Preparedness Standard EOP 0121. In February 2024, it approved standards EOP 0114 and TOP 0025. In June 2024, it approved EOP 0122. In September 2025, it approved EOP 0123 and set its effective date as October 1st, 2025. For the first time in American regulatory history, as of October 1st, 2025, generators subject to NERC reliability standards are required to have documented cold weather preparedness plans, identifying their critical cold weather components, establishing minimum operating temperature ratings based on actual performance rather than engineering estimates, and developing protocols for extreme cold operations. That is genuinely new. It didn't exist before Uri, but one FERC commissioner raised a concern in a concurring opinion when the February 2024 standards were approved that deserves attention. The implementation timeline for the new and revised provisions of Standard EOP J1114 would not require compliance until approximately April 1st, 2027, 3 years after regulatory approval. The commissioner wrote, 3 years after regulatory approval to implement changes to a reliability standard is an awfully long time. By the time these standards are implemented, recent experience has taught us that we are likely to face one or more dangerous winter storms. 3 years, 3 winters, and during those 3 winters, the generator standards that existed before October, so 2025, were the standards in effect. Uri happened, Elliott happened, Jerry and Heather happened, Fern happened, all before the comprehensive cold weather preparedness standards became mandatory. The deeper regulatory gap, the one that every report has identified and none has resolved, is the upstream natural gas system. NRC's own 2024 Winter Reliability Assessment stated plainly, there is, outside of Texas, little to no information to indicate that upstream gas producers, gatherers, and processors have improved winterization of their operations. Not insufficient improvement. Little to no information indicating any improvement. In the years following Uri, in the years following Elliott's 90,500 megawatt simultaneous failure and its 54% Utica shale production collapse, the gas producers who supply the fuel that 43% of American electricity depends on have not been required to report their winterization status, have not been subject to inspection, and have not been subject to penalty for freeze-off related production failures. FERC Chairman Willie Phillips said it plainly and said it repeatedly, someone, it doesn't have to be FERC, must have authority to establish and enforce natural gas reliability standards. NERC's CEO Jim Robb echoed it. I echo the chairman's call for an authority to set and enforce winterization standards for the natural gas system upstream of power generation. The Elliott report called for congressional legislation. The winter of 2026 has now passed, with Fern as its signature event, and no such legislation has been enacted. The FARC Reliability Spotlight Tracker, the agency's own public tracking page for implementation of post-Uri and post-Elliott recommendations, shows the status of each recommendation with color-coded indicators. Blue for completed, green for progressing as expected, yellow for more progress needed. The critical natural gas infrastructure identification recommendation has been completed for Texas specifically. For the rest of North America, yellow. The voluntary nature of gas producer winterization remains the unresolved load-bearing absence in the entire regulatory architecture. What this 32-year warning chain reveals is not malice or conspiracy. It reveals something arguably more fundamental, a regulatory system that was not designed with the gas-electric interdependency in mind. FERC has authority over the bulk electric power system. It does not have authority over natural gas production and gathering. Those systems fall under the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission for interstate pipelines. But the upstream production system is primarily regulated at the state level, where no state outside Texas has established mandatory winterization requirements. The Department of Transportation's PHMSA regulates pipeline safety, but not reliability under cold weather conditions. NERC can regulate generators. It cannot regulate the gas fields those generators depend on. The jurisdictional seams between agencies are exactly where the fuel supply chain vulnerability lives, and each report names this. And the next storm arrives before legislation passes to address it. This investigation has traced the polar vortex event, the gas-electric feedback loop, the geographic vulnerability map, and the regulatory gap. Each of those threads is significant on its own, but the reason winter grid failures of the Uri magnitude produce humanitarian crises rather than just operational problems is that they don't arrive sequentially. They arrive simultaneously, and the simultaneity is the catastrophe multiplier. Consider what a major polar vortex cold outbreak looks like as a compound event, not as a sequence of things going wrong, one after another, but as a cascade of simultaneous failures, each of which complicates the response to the others. The cold air arrives. In the first hours, demand for electricity and natural gas spikes across an enormous geographic area. The entire footprint of the cold air mass, which can cover millions of square miles of the continental interior. This isn't a local surge that a regional grid operator can manage by importing power from neighbors. Every neighbor in the affected footprint is experiencing the same surge simultaneously. At the same time the demand surges, the production system that supplies the fuel starts failing. Wellheads freeze, gathering lines block, gas pipeline pressure begins dropping across the Haynesville Basin in Louisiana, across the Permian Basin in West Texas, across the Appalachian shale fields. The regions that supply gas to the Southeast, to the Mid-Atlantic, to New England, to Texas, all under the same cold air mass. The gas field freeze-offs are not happening in a production region that's warm, while the consumption region is cold. Both are cold simultaneously. Gas-fired generators begin losing fuel. They trip offline. The grid loses generation capacity. The frequency on the grid, which must be maintained at 60 Hz for equipment to function properly, begins dropping. Automatic protection systems activate. More generators trip. Grid operators begin manually curtailing load, cutting power to some areas to prevent the frequency collapse that would bring down the entire interconnected system. Rolling blackouts begin. When the rolling blackouts hit neighborhoods, the ice that has been accumulating on distribution lines and trees during the storm, the same ice that Fern deposited across the South in January 2026, has already taken down some distribution lines. Repair crews are staged, but they cannot reach many of the failed sections. The roads are iced over. The same cold that's causing the generation failure is preventing the crews from repairing the distribution system. Emergency services are fielding simultaneous calls, carbon monoxide poisonings from generators running indoors, hypothermia from elderly residents in unheated homes, car accidents on iced roads, pipe bursts flooding homes, medical emergencies from devices running out of battery. The Emergency Services Dispatch Center is queuing calls. The hospitals are on backup power. Some of the specialized generators designed to restart the grid after a collapse, 154 black start units failed during Elliott, as Keel Lyons documented, are themselves offline because they're gas-fired and they've lost fuel. The gas-electric interdependency creates a specific feedback in this compound scenario that Keel Lyons data illuminates. At the worst point of Winter Storm Elliott, 90,500 megawatts of generation was simultaneously offline. 119 of the 154 black start units that faced outages were gas-fired. The generators designed to restart the system in a catastrophic failure were themselves failing in the conditions that would trigger a catastrophic failure. The safety mechanism depends on the fuel that the event is disrupting. NERC's explicit acknowledgement of the wide area import constraint belongs in this compound picture. The standard mitigation for regional supply shortfalls is importing power from neighboring grid regions that have surplus. During a wide area cold outbreak, the kind a major SSW event produces, neighboring regions are simultaneously in deficit. The import route is closed, and the regional grid operator, ERCOT in Texas, the regional reliability coordinators in the Southeast, cannot import enough power from outside the cold air mass to compensate for the generation losses within it. The grid is an island during the event, even if it's nominally connected. Con Edison's near collapse on Christmas Eve 2022 illustrates the human dimension of this compound picture in a specific place. David Huff at FERC's Electric Reliability Office reported that the natural gas utility serving Manhattan, the Bronx, and parts of Queens was on the verge of system collapse due to low pipeline pressure. Manhattan, New York City, if Consolidated Edison's gas system had collapsed on December 24th, 2022, if the weather hadn't warmed on Christmas Day, natural gas service to one of the densest concentrations of people in North America would have been disrupted. The hospitals, the apartment buildings, the heating systems of millions of people in a city where outdoor temperatures that night were below zero. Jim Robb said it clearly, had the weather not warmed up on Christmas Day, it is highly likely that natural gas service would have been disrupted to New York City. The weather warmed. That is the margin. Not engineering, not investment, not regulation, a favorable shift in the weather. The compound nature of major cold events is what makes them so difficult to respond to in real time. Emergency managers planning for a snowstorm can stage resources, clear roads, open warming shelters, position fuel. But a compound event that simultaneously collapses generation, reduces fuel supply, takes down distribution lines, blocks repair access, overwhelms emergency services, and removes the import safety valve does not respond to any single intervention. It requires simultaneous, coordinated action across systems that are managed by different entities under different regulatory frameworks, and it requires that action to begin before the event, because once it's underway, the window for mitigation is largely closed. This is the compound layer that this investigation has been building toward, and it is the layer that the atmospheric science now connects to a mechanism that operates on average every other winter. There are two things that commonly get said about polar vortex events and climate change that deserve honest examination, because both of them, in their simplest forms, are wrong. The first is this: a warming Arctic will reduce polar vortex disruptions because there will be less cold air to escape. The second, cold winters prove climate change isn't real. Both of these claims fail on the evidence, and this investigation is going to address them directly. Not because conspiracy theorists need to be humored, but because the actual science is more complicated and more interesting than either claim, and because getting this right matters for understanding what the real risk is. I want to address this directly because it deserves an honest answer grounded in physics, not just dismissal. On the HAARP question first, because it comes up in coverage of any major weather event. The High Frequency Active Auroral Research Program operates at power levels of approximately 3.6 megawatts. The energy required to warm the polar stratosphere by 30 to 50 degrees Celsius across the relevant atmospheric volume, millions of cubic kilometers at altitudes of 32 kilometers and above, is many orders of magnitude beyond any human engineering system on Earth. The actual physical mechanism producing sudden stratospheric warming events is the upward propagation of large amplitude planetary Rossby waves. Atmospheric waves generated by the interaction of surface wind patterns with the Rocky Mountains, the Ural Mountains, and the temperature gradients at the surface of the Pacific and Atlantic. This mechanism was identified in the 1950s and has been continuously documented in the observational record since systematic atmospheric measurements began. No external forcing is required. The atmosphere does this on its own through well-understood physics. The real story doesn't need a conspiracy. The ordinary physics is alarming enough without embellishment. On the Arctic warming question, Jennifer Francis at the Woodwell Climate Research Center, who published what she describes as the first paper to propose in broader terms how Arctic amplification affects extreme weather patterns, in 2012, identified what she characterizes as robust relationships between Arctic warming and a wavier jet stream. The mechanism she proposed: as the Arctic warms faster than the global average, the temperature gradient between the Arctic and the mid-latitudes that powers the jet stream diminishes. A weaker gradient means a slower, more meandering jet stream. A more meandering jet stream generates more planetary wave energy. More wave energy propagating upward into the stratosphere means more frequent or more intense polar vortex disruptions. This is the proposed connection. It is a scientifically serious hypothesis. It is also one that remains actively debated in the research community. Amy Butler at NOAA provides the honest scientific counterweight. I don't think there is any convincing evidence of a long-term trend in the polar vortex. The quiet period of the 1990s, when no major SW events occurred for almost a decade, and the subsequent active period are, in Butler's assessment, more consistent with natural variability than with a climate-driven trend. The sample size, a few decades of reliable stratospheric observations, is not long enough to confidently distinguish a trend from variability. What is, supported by the evidence, what the Science Advances 2025 paper documents directly, is that extreme winter cold events in the central and eastern United States have not decreased in frequency or intensity, even as overall winter temperatures have warmed since 1980. The winters are warmer on average. The extreme events are not becoming rarer. This specific finding is peer-reviewed, it covers a 45-year observational record, and it connects directly to the mechanistic research on how polar vortex variability produces surface cold outbreaks. The real human fingerprint in this story, the real place where human decisions have determined outcomes, is not atmospheric manipulation. It is regulatory capture. It is the market design that made winterization investment unrecoverable in Texas's deregulated electricity market. It is the 32-year chain of recommendations that were acknowledged and not implemented. It is the jurisdictional seams between FFARC's authority over the bulk electric system and the absence of any federal authority over upstream gas production weatherization. It is the Public Utility Commission of Texas eliminating its Oversight and Enforcement Division months before Uri. These are the choices that converted an atmospheric event into a humanitarian crisis. Not HARP, not weather modification. Policy decisions, regulatory structures, and investment choices made by identifiable institutions over identifiable years that left 246 confirmed people dead and a grid 4 minutes and 37 seconds from collapse. The climate signal, honestly assessed, says this: the polar vortex will continue to disrupt roughly every other winter, within a range that may or may not be changing due to Arctic amplification. Cold extremes in the central and eastern United States will continue. The atmospheric mechanism is not going away, and the infrastructure beneath it, now carrying more winter demand than ever, still dependent on a voluntarily winterized gas system in regions that NERC has explicitly named as at elevated risk, is the variable that human decisions can actually change. This investigation has assembled a specific set of verified facts: the atmospheric mechanism, the 5-storm pattern, the regulatory timeline, the gas system vulnerability, the current geographic risk map, the human cost of what happens when the loop runs to completion. There are 3 intellectually honest ways to interpret what this evidence means. This investigation is going to present all 3 of them. Not to be equivocal, but because the evidence genuinely supports more than one interpretation, and pretending otherwise would be the opposite of what this channel commits to. The first interpretation is the most generous to the institutions responsible for grid reliability, and it earns some credibility because the improvements since Uri are real. Generator cold weather preparedness standards now exist. They didn't before 2021. Standard EOP 0123, which became mandatory in October 2025, requires generators to identify their critical cold weather components, document their actual minimum operating temperatures based on performance rather than engineering estimates, closing the gap that Keel Lyons identified, where nearly 80% of freezing failures occurred at temperatures above the documented minimums, and establish operational protocols for extreme cold events. This is genuinely new regulatory infrastructure. It didn't exist when Uri hit. Gas-electric coordination has demonstrably improved in some regions. A FERC-NERC joint report on the January 2025 Arctic cold wave specifically noted improved performance in the VACAR South region, Virginia, and the Carolinas, attributing it to enhanced coordination between pipeline operators and electric grid and generator operators, including proactive issuance of operational flow orders and real-time situational awareness calls. That coordination helped the region manage a significant cold event without the failures that characterized Uri and Elliott. Texas specifically made substantial investments after Uri. The state added 23,114 megawatts of solar capacity, 8,343 megawatts of wind capacity, and thousands of megawatts of battery storage after the 2021 crisis. That diversification helped ERCOT manage the January 2025 cold snap without triggering the catastrophic failures of 4 years earlier. Progress is visible in the data. And the ERCOT controlled load shed probability for the upcoming winter, 1.8%, is a low number. For normal winter conditions, all regions have adequate resources. The assessments that flag risk are explicitly flagging extreme conditions, not average ones. The generous interpretation concludes the system is improving. The regulatory framework is being strengthened. The near-term risk is manageable in anything but the most extreme scenario. The infrastructure is better positioned for a major cold event than it was in 2021. The second interpretation accepts the improvements while identifying the gaps that remain. The generator standards are real but incomplete. They apply to generators. They do not apply to the gas producers who supply them. NERC's own 2024 Winter Reliability Assessment acknowledges that outside Texas, there is little to no information indicating upstream gas producers have improved their winterization. The fuel supply chain, the wellheads, gathering lines, and processing plants that feed gas into the pipeline network remains voluntary territory. A generator that has passed its cold weather preparedness plan audit can still lose its fuel if the upstream system freezes. Distribution systems in southern states are not meaningfully more winterized than they were before Uri. Winter Storm Fern demonstrated this in January 2026. 1 million customers lost power, primarily from ice on trees and distribution lines, in states that have had 5 years since Uri to harden their distribution infrastructure. The investment hasn't happened at scale. The same distribution failure mode that Fern revealed would compound a generation crisis during a full SSW event. The implementation timeline creates a specific window of vulnerability. The most comprehensive cold weather standard, EOP 0123, only became mandatory in October 2025. The additional provisions of EOP 0114 won't require full compliance until April 2027. Those standards have never been tested in a major polar vortex cold outbreak. We don't yet know whether the requirements are sufficient because the event that would reveal their sufficiency hasn't occurred while they have been in force. The intermediate interpretation concludes, the system has improved, but the improvement is incomplete in ways that matter during the specific scenario. This investigation describes a wide area SSW-driven cold outbreak hitting the southeast and Texas simultaneously with gas system freeze-offs, distribution system ice damage, and overwhelmed mutual aid capacity all arriving at the same time. The third interpretation is the most concerning, and it grounds its concern in the compound convergence of factors that this investigation has documented. Winter electricity demand is growing at the fastest rate in recent years, 20.2 gigawatts over 1 year, driven by heat pump adoption, data center growth, and electrification. The regions with the fastest demand growth include SERC's East and ERCOT. The regions NERC has identified as at elevated risk in extreme cold. The types of generation growing fastest, solar and battery storage, are the least reliable during extreme winter cold. The generation mix is becoming simultaneously more demand exposed and less cold weather reliable. No federal authority exists to compel the natural gas system to winterize. Congressional legislation to establish this authority has been called for in multiple official reports across multiple years and has not been enacted. The voluntary nature of gas producer winterization in most of North America means that the primary fuel for 43% of American electricity has no enforceable cold weather reliability standard outside one state. This gap has been open through 5 grid-threatening winter events in 11 years. The wide area import constraint is a structural feature of the mutual aid system that gets worse as winter demand grows in more regions simultaneously. When more regions are simultaneously demand stressed, there's less surplus capacity available for import anywhere in the interconnection during a wide area event. The most concerning interpretation concludes the conditions that would produce a catastrophic outcome have not been meaningfully altered in the ways that most matter. The generator standards are an improvement at one point in the supply chain. The rest of the chain, gas production, gas gathering, gas processing, gas pipeline delivery, distribution system physical hardening in southern states, has not been subject to enforceable requirements sufficient to change the risk profile of a wide area major SSW event. What data would distinguish between these three interpretations? The most important data is the one NERC says doesn't exist: information on whether upstream gas producers outside Texas have improved their cold weather readiness. If there is a body of evidence that wellhead operators in the Haynesville, Permian, and Appalachian regions have systematically implemented methanol injection systems, heating cables, and enclosed compression equipment that would materially change the fuel supply risk, that data has not been collected or reported. It may not exist. The second distinguishing data set is the cold weather performance data from generators operating under EOP 0123 during the first major cold event it encounters. The standards require preparedness plans. Whether those plans produce better performance than the 80% failure rate at above minimum temperature conditions during Elliott is an open empirical question that will be answered by the next sufficiently cold winter. The third distinguishing factor is congressional action. Legislation establishing federal authority over natural gas infrastructure reliability would fundamentally change the regulatory architecture that every post-Uri report has identified as the critical gap. Whether that legislation is enacted before the next major SSW event will determine whether the gap is addressed before or after it is exploited again. Strip away the interpretation. Strip away the projection and the policy analysis. Strip this investigation to what is confirmed, sourced, and not reasonably in dispute. This is what the evidence shows. The atmospheric mechanism is real and recurring. Sudden stratospheric warming events disrupt the Arctic polar vortex roughly every other winter, on average. When major disruptions occur, they couple downward to the troposphere over 10 to 30 days and elevate the probability of extreme cold air outbreaks in the central and eastern United States 5 to 25 days later. This has been documented in the instrumental record back to the 1950s and in peer-reviewed research through 2025. The March 2025 SSW abruptly ended the Northern Hemisphere stratospheric polar vortex for the winter season, against a NOAA preseason forecast that gave a 55% probability this would not occur. The mechanism is not going away. Extreme winter cold events in the central and eastern United States have not decreased in frequency or intensity despite overall warming trends. The infrastructure failure pattern is established and consistent. 5 major cold weather events in 11 years: 2011, 2014, 2021, 2022, 2024 through 2026 jeopardized bulk power system reliability. Across every documented event, 96% of all generation outages, derates, and failures to start are attributed to 3 causes: freezing issues, fuel issues, and mechanical or electrical issues correlated to cold temperatures. Nearly 80% of generating units that fail due to freezing fail at temperatures above their own documented minimum operating temperatures. The Texas grid was 4 minutes and 37 seconds from complete statewide blackout in February 2021. During Winter Storm Elliott, 90,500 megawatts of generation failed simultaneously, the largest controlled firm load shed in Eastern interconnection history. Natural gas production in Texas fell 45% during Uri. The Utica Shale declined 54% during Elliott. In January 2026, freeze-offs reached 13.5 billion cubic feet per day of impact. These are not estimates. These are documented measurements. The regulatory gap is confirmed. Cold weather reliability standard EOP 0123 became mandatory for generators on October 1st, 2025. This is an improvement. Natural gas infrastructure freeze protection remains voluntary in most of North America outside Texas. confirmed by NERC's own 2025 through 2026 winter reliability assessment using those exact words. No federal authority currently has the power to compel upstream gas producers to winterize. FERC Chairman Willie Phillips called for such authority repeatedly. Jim Robb, NERC's president and CEO, called for it. Multiple FERC-NERC reports recommended congressional action to establish it. No such legislation has been enacted as of April 2026. The geographic risk is mapped and named. NERC's November 2025 Winter Reliability Assessment explicitly identifies 7 regions at elevated or high risk of supply shortfalls under extreme winter conditions. NPCC Maritimes, NPCC New England, SRC East, SRC Central, Texas RE ERCOT, WECC Basin, and WECC Northwest. SRC East has transitioned from a summer peaking to a dual season peaking region due to solar PV shaving, summer peaks, and electrification of heating increasing winter demand. SRC East's probabilistic risk is concentrated in winter morning hours when solar generation is near zero and heating demand is at its maximum. Winter electricity demand is growing at the fastest rate in recent years, 20.2 gigawatts over 1 year, and the types of resources growing fastest are less reliable in extreme winter conditions than the dispatchable generation they accompany. The import safety valve that stabilizes individual regions in local cold events is explicitly acknowledged by NERC to fail during wide area events, which are exactly what major SSW-driven cold outbreaks produce. The human cost is documented. At least 246 confirmed deaths in Texas from Winter Storm Uri. Excess mortality research indicates the true number is substantially higher. Average outage duration 46 hours, at least 300 carbon monoxide poisoning cases. A 60-year-old man found in a 37-degree apartment. An 85-year-old woman who developed hypothermia and didn't survive. More than 50 deaths from Winter Storm Fern in January 2026. 6 deaths in South Carolina alone, 4 from hypothermia, in a storm that did not produce a major generation collapse. What this investigation cannot confirm with certainty whether the frequency of major SSW events is increasing due to Arctic amplification, whether the generator improvements from EOP 0123 are sufficient to prevent cascading failures when the gas supply system freezes, whether upstream gas producers outside Texas have voluntarily improved their cold weather readiness since 2021, whether congressional action on Natural Gas Reliability Authority will occur before the next major SSW cold outbreak. The primary open loop of this investigation, the question posed in the earliest frames of this video, the question that has driven every section of the evidence that followed, asks whether the pattern of polar vortex disruptions and the compound infrastructure vulnerability make another catastrophic winter event more likely. The honest answer from this evidence is not a probability estimate. Probabilities require data on gas producer winterization that NERC says doesn't exist. They require cold weather performance data from EOP 0123's first major test, which hasn't happened yet. What the evidence supports is this: the atmospheric mechanism that produced the conditions for Uri is operating. The geographic regions it targets overlap with the regions NERC has named as at elevated risk. The gap in the regulatory architecture that every post-Uri report identified as the critical vulnerability, mandatory cold weather standards for the upstream gas system, remains open as of April 2026. The demand on the grid in the affected regions is increasing faster than dispatchable supply. A major SSW event is not guaranteed to produce a catastrophic outcome, but the conditions that would produce one are not meaningfully different from the conditions that existed in February 2021. This investigation will continue. There are 4 specific things this channel is watching, not because they are the most dramatic developments in this story, but because they are the most diagnostic. They are the data points that will most clearly distinguish between the 3 interpretations this investigation presented. The first is cold weather performance data from generators operating under EOP 0123 during the first major cold event it encounters. That standard has been in force since October 2025. It has not yet been tested in a polar vortex cold outbreak of Uri's magnitude. When that event occurs, and the atmospheric science says the probability of it occurring in any given 2-year window is meaningful. The performance record of generators under the new standard will be the most important piece of evidence this story has yet to produce. Did the preparedness plans translate into actual preparedness? Or did generators still fail at temperatures above their documented minimums, as nearly 80% did during Elliott? The second is the gas producer winterization data that NERC says, as of its most recent assessment, doesn't exist. Outside Texas, there is, in NERC's words, little to no information, indicating upstream gas producers have improved their cold weather readiness. If that information becomes available, if gas producers begin voluntarily reporting weatherization status, or if a state outside Texas establishes a reporting requirement, it would materially change the assessment of fuel supply risk during a major cold event. The absence of that data is itself the signal this channel is tracking. The moment it changes, Signal Watch will be here. The third is congressional action on Natural Gas Infrastructure Reliability Authority. Every FERC-NERC report on every major cold weather event since 2021 has recommended that Congress establish a regulatory authority with the power to set and enforce winterization standards for the upstream gas system. That recommendation has been made across multiple administrations, with bipartisan support from grid operators and reliability experts, and has not been translated into legislation. If it is enacted, the architecture of winter grid risk in the United States changes in a fundamental way. If it is not enacted before the next major SSW cold outbreak hits the regions NERC has named, the next post-event report will recommend it again. The fourth is the CERC East demand resource trajectory. The dual season peaking transition in the Southeast is ongoing. Data center demand is growing. Heat pump adoption is accelerating. The winter morning peak in January and February, the gap when solar hasn't ramped and heating demand is at its maximum, is growing wider. If the generation additions in the Southeast keep pace with this demand growth, the risk profile stabilizes. If they don't, the probabilistic risk of load loss in extreme conditions grows with each passing year. Signal Watch will track the NERC assessments as they're released. The people who watch this channel live in these regions. Some of them lived through Uri, some of them lived through Fern, some of them spent 46 hours in a cold house. Some of them checked on elderly neighbors. Some of them are the utility workers who drove out to repair lines on iced roads in the dark. The investigation that this channel does exists because those experiences deserve to be connected to the atmospheric physics, to the regulatory record, to the grid reliability data that explains why they happened and what would need to change for them not to happen again. The investigation is not finished. It is never finished with a story like this, because the story isn't finished. The atmospheric mechanism runs on its own schedule, indifferent to regulatory timelines and congressional sessions. The polar vortex will disrupt again. The cold will reach south. The question this investigation keeps asking, the question that every FERC-NERC report has also been asking, in its precise regulatory language, is whether the infrastructure will be ready.
We will be watching. We will be here when the data arrives. And if the next major polar vortex event produces outcomes that require a follow-up to this investigation, Signal Watch will be the first place you hear about it, with the specific numbers, the named sources, and the full picture that the evidence actually supports. We'll see you then.